Hi, fifth graders, and welcome to another ELA lesson. I'm Miss Mooney, and I hope you're having a great day so far, and I can't wait to get started on today's lesson. So the topic today is main characters, and this is also the second video that we'll be talking about this book, Esperanza Rising. So our objective today is that I can answer questions about the main character of the novel Esperanza Rising based on evidence from the text. So today, all the materials you will need is your ELA notebook or something to write in. You'll need something to write with. And then this is optional, but you might already have a copy of this book from school, or you can go ahead in the learning guide and see the link to the PDF version of the book to read online, or you can just read along with me on the screen. It'll be posted on the screen as well. So let's do a quick vocabulary review. The first word that we've learned so far this week is characterization, and that is the creation or construction of a fictional character. We also learned that the genre of this book is historical fiction, and historical fiction is a story based on real events, real settings, and some real people, but also include many imagined events and characters. And then also, we are introducing a new vocabulary word today, and that word is main character. So this is the character who the story is mostly about, or who the story is from the point of view from. Oftentimes, the main character has their name as the title of the movie or the book. So that's also kind of a good indicator that that's the main character as well. So let's go ahead and look at a couple examples of main characters. So, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. So, just like our example said, sometimes the main character is the name of the book, and we know the main character of Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is the character Charlie. One of my favorite movies, Shrek. So, we know that Shrek's face is on the cover of this movie poster. And so, we also know that Shrek is the main character of the movie Shrek. Next, we have the movie Mulan, another one of my favorites, and we know that Mulan is the main character of Mulan. So again, it's the name of the main character is on the cover of the book, or it's said on the book. That doesn't happen every single time, but those are just a couple examples where it does. And then you might have guessed it, but the book we're reading right now, Esperanza. And so Esperanza is both on the picture of the book, and then also her name is the book. And so that tells us that Esperanza is our main character of the book. So from the first chapter that we've read, we're going to go through and do a warm-up of a couple of discussion questions. So these are questions that you can think about. They're ones that you can write down if you would like. So they are based on the first chapter of this book. And so if you have not read the first chapter, you can follow that link and you can go ahead and read it right now. It's only a couple of pages. But these are the two questions that we have. So question 1. Describe the geographical setting of Esperanza Rising. What is it like where Esperanza lives? Use details from the text to support your answer. So that's the first question that's about the actual place where Esperanza lives. So we know that Esperanza lives in Mexico, and we looked at a couple different pictures of Mexico. And also we know that what city she lives in and time era. So go ahead and jot down an answer for that one. And then our second question is, what is Esperanza's relationship with her papa like? How do you know this? So those are our two questions. So if you have read the first chapter, go ahead and pause the video right now and write them down in your ELA notebook. This might take about 10 to 15 minutes to do so. So go ahead and pause right now to write down some answers. All right, so now I'm going to share with you some example answers. So these were just answers that I came up with. So yours might be a little different. You can add anything I wrote down to yours. But for the first question, I wrote down that Esperanza lives in Aguascalientes, Mexico in 1924. So that is the geographical setting, because we know that the setting is Mexico, and the city that she lives in is really important for the book. And it's also in 1924. She lives with her family in an area with a lot of green land. The land is beautiful, and her father feels that the land is alive. And so that's how the first chapter starts, is by Papa saying that the land is alive. So those were the details from the text that I used to support my answer. And then, oh, sorry, this is number 1. It's supposed to say number 2. But for number 2, what is Esperanza's relationship with her papa like? How do you know? So I wrote that Esperanza loves and trusts her father. I know this because Esperanza enjoys spending time with her father on the land and trusts that he will help her feel the land. So in the first paragraph, it talks about how Papa taught Esperanza how to lay down on the ground and feel the heartbeat of the land. And it also says that she gazes up at him, showing that she is in awe of her father, which also means like she just thinks he's amazing and that she just really loves him. So those were my two answers to the discussion questions. So chapter 2 is what we're going to be talking about today. So you might have already read chapter 2. If you haven't, that's totally fine too, because we're going to be going through and we're going to be reading a couple pages together. So don't worry if you haven't read it yet. If you would like to read it, you can pause right now and you can go on the link or with your own copy and you can read it silently to yourself if you would like, or you can just follow along with me as I read the pages. So as we read chapter 2, Las Uvas, we are going to think about the characters. So we're going to be thinking about what the characters are like, how the characters change over time, and what challenges the characters face. So as we go on and we read some more about chapter 2, that is what we really want to focus on today, as our topic today is on the main character. And so we're going to be talking a lot about Esperanza today, and then also answering some questions about her. So I'm just going to go through and I'm going to read pages 4 through 6 just to get us started for today. So you can go ahead and you can read along with me if you would like. You can read silently to yourself, or you can just listen to me read it. So I'm going to start on page 4. Las uvas, or grapes. 6 years later. So we know that chapter 2 starts 6 years after chapter 1. Papa handed Esperanza the knife. The short blade was curved like a scythe. Its fat wooden handle fitting snugly in her palm. This job was usually reserved for the eldest son of a wealthy rancher. But since Esperanza is an only child and Papa's pride and glory, she was always given the honor. Last night, she watched Papa sharpen the knife back and forth across the stone, so she knew it was a tool edged like a razor. "E quado les dedos," said Papa. "Watch your fingers." The August sun promised a dry afternoon in Aguascalientes, Mexico. Everyone who lived and worked on El Ranchero de las Rosas was gathered at the edge of the field. Esperanza's family, the house servants in their long white aprons, the vaqueros already sitting in their horses, ready to ride out to the cattle, and 50 or 60 campesinos, straw hats in their hands, holding their knives ready. They were covered top to bottom in long-sleeve shirts, baggy pants tied at the ankles with strings, and bandanas wrapped around their foreheads and necks to protect them from the sun, dust, and the spiders. Esperanza, on the other hand, wore a light silk dress that stopped above her summer boots and no hat. On top of her head, a wide satin ribbon was tied in a big bow, the tails trailing to her long black hair. The clusters were heavy on the vine and ready to deliver. So when it says clusters, I'm kind of thinking maybe that's grapes, since that's the title of our chapter. So that's what I'm inferring right now. Esperanza's parents, Ramona and Sixto Ortega, stood nearby. Mama, tall and elegant, her hair in a usual braided wreath that crowned her head, and Papa, barely taller than Mama, his graying mustache twisted at the sides. He swept his hand toward the grapevine, signaling Esperanza. When she walked towards the arbors and glanced back at her parents, they both smiled and nodded, encouraging her forward. When she reached the vines, she separated the leaves and carefully grasped a thick stem. She put the knife to it, and with a quick swipe, the heavy cluster of grapes dropped onto their waiting hand. Esperanza walked back to Papa and handed him the fruit. Papa kissed it and held it for all to see. La cosecha, said Papa. Harvest. Ole, ole, a cheer echoed around him. The campesinos, the field workers, spread out over the land and began the task of reaping the fields. Esperanza stood between Mama and Papa, with her arms linked to theirs, and admired the activity of the workers. "Papi, "This is my favorite time of year," she said, watching the brightly colored shirts of the workers slowly moving along the arbors. Wagons rattled back and forth on the fields to the big barns where the grapes would be stored until they went to the winery. "Is the reason because when the picking is done, it will be someone's birthday and time for a big fiesta?" Papa asked. Esperanza smiled. When the grapes delivered their harvest, she would turn another year. This year, she would be 13. So I'm going to stop right there just because we can't see the next sentence. But that's pages 4 through 6. So it sounds like they're starting to do a big harvest, and Esperanza got to cut the first fruit of the harvest, which was super exciting for her to do. So I want to quickly pause at the title of this chapter. So the title is Las Uvas, or grapes. So a lot of the times, especially in Esperanza Rising, the title actually lets us know what the chapter is going to be about. And so as we read on, we saw that they were harvesting the grapes, and all of the workers came to see it, and everyone was so excited to see the grapes being harvested. And so that's pretty cool that the chapter name actually tells us what the chapter will be about. And we know this is 6 years later, and so Esperanza is no longer 6 years old. She's now 12, and she's about to turn 13. So if that was a little too quick for you, feel free to pause right now and read these pages back on your own as well. So what we're going to be doing today is learning how to answer what's called comprehension questions. So what comprehension questions are is that they're questions about the text, and it shows how well we comprehend the text, or how well we remembered or we understood what the text was saying. And so when we're asked a comprehension question, we're able to find that question in the text and use evidence to answer that. So I put together 3 steps on how we're going to be answering our comprehension questions. So the first step is that we're going to read the question. So before we even start doing the reading of our passage, we're going to read the question so that we can get to understand what the question is about, what we should really be looking for during our read. And then for step 2, we're going to want to make sure that we understand the question. So you don't really know what you're going to be looking for if the question doesn't make sense. So we're going to read through the question, make sure that it makes sense to us. We can look up any words that don't make sense, but really just get a good understanding of what we're looking for. And then our next step is, while we're reading, we're going to be wanting to take notes. So that's why I had you get out your notebooks. And so you can see a little bit, it's kind of blurry that these are my notes. I'll show you pictures of these notes as we go through. So these 3 steps will help us just understand our comprehension questions a little bit better, and also keep us on track for when it comes time to write down our answers. So let's go ahead and get started with the text that we'll be reading. All right, so let's get started with question number 1. So I'm going to go ahead and read question number 1 out loud for us. The first paragraph on page 8, so that tells us what page we're looking for, says that Esperanza would like to live at El Rancho de las Rosas with her mama and papa forever. Why does she feel this way? Find details from the text to explain your answer. So our first step is that we read our question. Our second step is, let's make sure that we understand what the question is asking. So I see that it's talking about El Rancho de las Rosas, so we know that is the field that her parents own. And then so the question is really just asking us, why does she feel like she wants to stay there forever? I don't know. That's what we're going to be finding out. So while we read, you want to make sure that you jot down any kind of information that you think might help us. So if you have like the actual book with you at home, this might be putting sticky notes on it. Or if you had a printout, it would be writing notes on the side. But since we don't all have that, we're going to be writing the notes in our notebook. So I'm going to start reading a couple of pages to help us find it. So remember, we're looking for page 8, but I'm going to start reading page 7 so that it's a good start for page 8. So we're not just starting right in the middle of the sentence. So I'm going to start with the second paragraph that says Marisol Rodriguez. Marisol Rodriguez, her best friend, Esperanza's best friend, would come with her family to celebrate. And so right now, we know from the last page that we were reading is that they're going to be hosting a fiesta for the harvest, and they're also going to be hosting a party for Esperanza's birthday. So Marisol's saying that she's going to come celebrate with them. Her father was a fruit rancher, and they lived on the neighboring property. Even though their houses were acres apart, they met every Saturday beneath the home oak on a rise between the two ranches. Her other friends, Cheetah and Bernita, would be at the party too, but they lived farther away and Esperanza didn't see them as often. Their classes at St. Francis didn't start again until after the harvest, and she couldn't wait to see them. When they were all together, they talked about one thing, their quinceañeras, the presentation party they would have when they turned 15. They still had 2 more years to wait, but so much to discuss. The beautiful white gowns they would wear, the big celebrations where they would be presented, and the sons of the richest families who would dance with them. After their quinceañeras, they would be old enough to be courted or be married and become las patronas, the heads of the households, rise into their positions of their mothers before them. So just to kind of give a disclaimer, we know that this is in the 1920s, since this is 1924. So times might have been a little bit different then. So they're saying that after their quinceañeras, after they turned 15, that they would be ready to get married then. So times are a little bit different now, but that's just because this was in the 1920s. So a while ago. Esperanza preferred to think, though, that she and her someday husband would live with Mama and Papa forever, because she couldn't imagine living anywhere other than El Rancho de las Rosas, or with fewer servants, or without being surrounded by the people who adore her. It had taken every day of 3 weeks to put the harvest to bed, and now everyone anticipated the celebration. Esperanza remembered Mama's instructions as she gathered roses from Papa's garden. Tomorrow, bouquets of roses and baskets of grapes on every table. Papa had promised to meet her in the garden, and he never disappointed her. She bent over to pick a red bloom, fully open, and she pricked her finger on the vicious thorn. Big pearls of blood pulsed from the tip of her thumb, and she automatically thought, bad luck. So the question was asking us to read on the top of page 8, the first paragraph, and it was talking about Esperanza saying that she doesn't want to live anywhere other than Rancho de las Rosas. So that's really where we're going to start writing notes and writing bullet points or questions or anything that might help us answer the question. So let's go ahead and take a look at our question. Oh, but these were the notes that I wrote. So I told you that I was also reading and writing in my notebook, and so this was the first part. So I wrote that I know that she is an only child. We saw that on the first couple of pages where it talked about how she was the only child of her mom and dad. She loves her parents, and she loves being around her parents and people who adore her. She's excited for her quinceañera, and she also cannot imagine having fewer servants. And so I took down all of those notes from what I was reading on the text. And so as I was reading it, I was taking those notes to help me answer the question. So we'll talk about that a little bit more as we see question 2. But this was just kind of a modeling for you first. So I took these 2 pages, and these were some notes I jot down. So let's remind ourselves of our question. So the first paragraph on page 8 says that Esperanza would like to live at Rancho de las Rosas with her mama and papa forever. Why does she feel this way? Find details from the text to explain your answer. And then I put a picture of that paragraph right there again, where it says, Esperanza preferred to think, though, that she and her someday husband would live with mama and papa forever, because she couldn't imagine living anywhere other than El Rancho de las Rosas, or with fewer servants, or without being surrounded by the people who adore her. So we have to write down some kind of answer for this first question. So we also want to use details from the text to explain our answer. So go ahead and pause for a couple of minutes as you write down something for this question. So use the notes that you took. You can also go back a little bit if you want to reread anything, use this paragraph, but write down a couple different notes about why you think that Esperanza wants to live with Mama and Papa forever. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and show you the answer that I came up with. So I wrote that Esperanza is the only child of the wealthy rancher, which is her father, and she's also her father's pride and glory. So pride and glory means like she's so precious to him, and he's so proud of her, and he loves her, and he's prideful, that he has her as a daughter. So I got that from the first couple of pages. It also says her family employs many servants and farm workers. She's very happy to live with her parents and is mostly thinking about her upcoming birthday party and eventually her quinceañera. She can't imagine, and so this is the part where I wrote down a detail from the text. She can't imagine living with fewer servants or without being surrounded by the people who adore her. So that's how I answered this question. So I mostly put down that she wants to live at the ranch forever because she loves being with her parents. Her parents obviously love having her live there too. She's very excited thinking about parties and her quinceañera and the harvest. And then also my evidence from the text was that she can't imagine living with fewer servants or without being around people who adore her, also mean people who love her. So go ahead and finish up your question number 1. You can add any of the details that I wrote down as well. So pause right now if you have to finish that up. All right, let's take a look at question number 2 now. So for a reminder, we are going to read the question, we're going to understand the question, and then we're going to take notes as we read to help us answer the question. So this is number 2. There's 4 questions total. So let's go number 2. On pages 8 through 12, Esperanza and Mama seem to be worried about Papa. What specific words or phrases in this section of the novel help you know that they are worried? Why are they worried? Use evidence from the text in your answer. So this is kind of a long question, right? So we want to make sure that we really understand what it's asking. So the beginning of the question gives us an introduction about it, where it says that on pages 8 through 12, Esperanza and Mama seem to be worried. And then it's asking us to find specific words or phrases or things that they say that let us know that they're worried. We also want to know why they're worried. So we're going to be keeping those 2 things in mind. So first of all, we're going to be looking for words or phrases that share with us or tell us that they're worried. And then second, we're going to be looking for the reason why they're worried. And then we're also, again, going to use evidence from the text to support our answer. So let's go ahead and get started with the reading. So I'm going to read pages 8 through 12 for us. So as I'm reading, make sure you're jotting down notes about why they're worried or how we know that they're worried. And I'll also give you reminders as we're reading too to kind of tell you where we should be jotting down notes. So let's start with page 8. So I'm going to start right in the middle just because we've already read the top part. It had taken every day of 3 weeks to put the harvest to bed, and now everyone anticipated the celebration. Esperanza remembered Mama's instructions as she gathered the roses from Papa's garden. Tomorrow, bouquets of roses and baskets of grapes on every table. Papa had promised to meet her in the garden. He never disappointed her. She bent over and picked up a full red bloom, fully opened, and she pricked her finger on a vicious thorn. So to prick your finger, it means that the thorn scraped her a little bit and she was bleeding. Big pearls of blood pulsed on the tip of her thumb, and she automatically thought, bad luck. She quickly wrapped her hand in the corner of her apron and dismissed the premonition. Then she cautiously clipped the blown rose that had wounded her. Looking toward the horizon, she saw the last of the sun disappear behind the Sierra Madre. Darkness would settle quickly, and a feeling of uneasiness and worry nagged at her. So she's already telling us that she's feeling worried, and so that's a good detail right there that Esperanza was feeling uneasy, and she was also feeling worried. And so Papa said that he was going to promise, or Papa had promised that he was going to meet her in the garden, but he wasn't there. Where was Papa? He had left early that morning with the vaqueros to work the cattle, and he always came home before sundown, dusty from the mesquite grasslands and stomping his feet on the patio to get rid of the crusty dirt on his boots. Sometimes he even brought beef jerky that the cattlemen had made, and Esperanza always had to find it first, searching his shirt pockets while he hugged her. Tomorrow was her birthday, and she knew that she would be serenaded at sunrise, or sang to. Papa and the men who lived on the ranch would congregate below her window, their rich, sweet voices singing Las Manitas, the birthday song. She would run to her window and wave kisses to Papa and the others. Then downstairs she would begin to open her gifts. She knew that there would be a porcelain doll for Mama. He had given her one every year since she was born, and Mama would give her something that she made, linens, camisoles, or blouses embroidered with beautiful needlework. So that's like embroidery, as in like flowers and using yarn and thread to embroider. The linens always went into the trunk at the end of her bed for alguna dia, for someday. Esperanza's thumb would not stop bleeding. She picked up the baskets of roses and hurried from the garden, stopping on the patio to rinse her hand in the stone fountain. As the water soothed her, she looked through the massive wooden gates that opened onto the thousands of acres on Papa's land. Esperanza strained her eyes, so that means that she really squinted to try to see. Esperanza strained her eyes to see a dust cloud. That meant the riders were near and that Papa was finally home. But she saw nothing. In the dusky light, she walked around the courtyard to see the back of a large adobe and wood house. There she found Mama searching the horizon too. Mama, my finger! An angry thorn stabbed me, said Esperanza. Bad luck, said Mama, confirming the superstition, and then she half smiled. So those were the first 3 pages. So now we're going to go on and read the other 2 pages because I wanted us to read 8 through 12. So far in my notes, I've written down that Papa promised Esperanza that he would meet her in the rose garden. So on page 8, we saw that he had promised to meet her and he never broke his promises or disappointed her, but he wasn't there. We also see that Esperanza said that she felt uneasy and she felt worried on page 9. And then we saw that Esperanza strained her eyes when she was trying to look out on the horizon, and so did Mama. So let's go to page 11. Bad luck could mean nothing more than dropping a pan or breaking an egg. So they thought that getting pricked in the finger was bad luck. Mama put her arms around Esperanza's waist, and both of set eyes swept over the corrals, stables, and servants' quarters that sprawled in the distance. Esperanza was almost as tall as Mama, and everybody said that she would someday look just like her beautiful mother. Sometimes, when Esperanza twisted her hair on top of her head and looked in the mirror, she could see that that was almost true. There was they had the same black hair, wavy and thick, some dark lashes and fair, creamy skin. But it wasn't precisely Mama's face, because Papa's eyes were there too, shaped like fat brown almonds. He's just a little late, said Mama, and part of Esperanza's mind believed her, but the other part scolded him. Mama, the neighbors wanted him. The neighbors warned him just last night about bandits. Mama nodded, and a bit of the corner of her lip in worry. They both knew that even though it was 1930 and the revolution in Mexico had been over for 10 years, there was still resentment against the large landowners. So in the last lesson, we read that the Mexican Revolution started because of the landowners and the workers. So they're saying that even though this is now about 10 years later, they still know that there was resentment against the two. Change has not come fast enough, Esperanza. The wealthy still own most of the land, while some of the poor don't even have a garden plot. There's cattle grazing on the big ranches, yet some peasants are forced to eat cats. Papa is sympathetic and has given land to many of his workers. The people know that. But Mama, did the bandits know that? I hope so, said Mama quietly. I have already sent Alfonso and Miguel to look for them. Let's wait inside. Tea was ready in Papa's study, and so was Abulete. Come, Minita, my granddaughter, said Abuleta, holding up yarn and crochet hooks. I'm starting a new blanket, and we'll teach you the zigzag. So those are the ends of those 2 pages. So the other note that I wrote down is that Mama was saying that they were scared of bandits. So bandits are kind of like robbers, or they're just not good guys. They're just kind of mean, and they think that the bandits maybe somehow got to Papa, or something happened with them. So I wrote down that made them worried too. So these are my 3 notes. So it's that Papa promised Esperanza to meet her in the garden, but he wasn't there. I wrote down that Mama and Esperanza were straining their eyes, trying to look in the distance. That means that they were looking super, super hard. And that Mama and Esperanza were both worried about the bandits. So let's revisit question number 2. On pages 8 through 12, Esperanza and Mama seem to be worried about Papa. What specific words or phrases in this section, the novel, help you know that they are worried? Why are they worried? And we're also going to use evidence from the text in our answer. So this is the answer that I came up with. So you might have come up with an answer too. So let's go ahead and check out what I wrote down. So I wrote that Esperanza shows that she is worried when she says that Papa had promised to meet her and he never disappointed her, but he isn't there. And so that period 8 means that I found that information from page 8. Then she was worried about pricking her fingers with bad luck and asks, "Where's Papa?" So she pricked her finger and she was also still wondering where Papa was. So that shows that she was still worried. On page 10, she strained her eyes looking for him. Mama bites the corner lip of her lip in worry. And then the reason of why they were worried, on page 11, it says they had been warned about bandits. And even though the revolution has been over for 10 years, there is still resentment against the large landowners. So all of this is saying that the specific words or phrases in this section that told me why they were worried was that Esperanza said that Papa had never disappointed her before and that he promised to be in the garden, but he wasn't there. And then also she thought that she had bad luck and she was waiting for Papa. And then we also saw the phrase that Esperanza strained her eyes looking and that Mama bit the corner of her lip in worry. And the reason why they're worried was because of the bandits. So go ahead and pause right now to add any of that information to what you wrote down. All right, let's look at question number 3. So we are halfway done with our questions. So question number 3, on pages 14 and 15, what two pieces of advice does Abuelita give Esperanza? How does Esperanza respond to the advice? Use evidence from the text in your answer. So first, we just read it, and then second, we're trying to understand the question. So I understand that this question is saying that there are 2 pieces of advice that Esperanza's grandmother gave her. So advice is kind of like, it's like a lesson or it's someone trying to tell you something to help you out or to make you feel better or some wisdom that they're giving you. So grandma is giving Esperanza 2 pieces of advice, or 2 separate parts of advice. And then we want to know how Esperanza is responding to that advice. So let's read pages 14 and 15. So page 14. So I'm going to start with, what happened to your finger? What happened to your finger? Asked Abuelita. A big thorn, says Esperanza. So remember, she cut her finger on the thorn, it was bleeding. Abuelita nodded and said thoughtfully, "No hay rosas sin espinas." There are no rose without thorns. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to write that in my notes. There is no rose without thorns, because that is something that Esperanza is saying. That's something that Esperanza's grandmother is saying to her. It's text, so that might be a little piece of advice. Esperanza smiled, knowing that Abuelita wasn't talking about flowers at all, but that there is no life without difficulties. So when Grandma says there's no rose without thorns, she's using that as a metaphor to say that there's no life without difficulty. So that's one piece of advice. She watched the silver crochet needle dance back and forth in her grandmother's hand. When a strand of hair fell into her lap, Abuelita picked it up, held it against the yarn, and she stitched it into the blanket. So a piece of her hair fell out, and she put it in the blanket. Esperanza, in this way, my love and good wishes will be in the blanket forever. Now watch. It's 10 stitches up to the mountain, add 1 stitch, 9 stitches down to the bottom of the valley, stick 1. So basically what she's saying is she's teaching Esperanza how to knit in this. So she's saying that 10 stitches up to the mountain, so she's stitching up 10 times, add 1 stitch, 9 stitches down to the bottom, and then she skips 1. Esperanza picked up her own crochet needle and copied Abuelita's moments and then looked at her own crocheting. The tops of her mountains were lopsided and the bottoms of her valleys were all bunched up. So basically what she's saying is that her stitches don't look as good as her grandma's does. Abuelita smiled, reached over, pulled the yarn, unraveling all of Esperanza's rolls. Do not be afraid to start over, she said. Esperanza sighed and began again with 10 more stitches. So that's another piece of advice that Abuelita gave when she said, do not be afraid to start over. So those quotation marks showed us that was something that she said out loud. and said to Esperanza, so we know that was the second piece of advice. Softly humming Hortensina, the housekeeper, came in with a plate of small sandwiches. She offered one to Mama. No, thank you, said Mama. Hortensia sat the tray down and brought a shawl and wrapped it protectively around Mama's shoulders. Esperanza couldn't remember a time when Hortensia did not take care of them. When she was a Zapotoc Indian from Oaxaca with a short, solid figure and blue-black hair that braided down her back. Esperanza watched the two women to look out in the dark and couldn't help but think of Hortensia and was almost the opposite of Mama. So she's saying that the two women were like opposites from each other. Don't worry so much, said Hortensia. Alfonso and Miguel will find them. So it doesn't say this yet, but Alfonso is Hortensia. I have to practice saying that. Hortensia's husband, and then Miguel is her son. So these were the notes that I wrote down. So I wrote down that there was no rose without thorns and not to be afraid to start over. So let's go ahead and check out our third question again. And then I already have shown you the two answers that I wrote down. So question 3 said, on pages 14 through 15, what two pieces of advice does Abuelete give Esperanza? How does Esperanza respond to the advice? Use evidence from the text in our answers. So we already know the two pieces of advice that she gave. So there's no rose without thorns, and the second one was do not be afraid to start over. So I started both of my answers with that. And so for the first one, I wrote, there is no rose without thorns. Esperanza seems to understand and accept this advice because she smiles. And she says, Abuelete was not talking about flowers at all, and that there was no life without difficulty. So since Esperanza explained to us what Abuelete meant by that, it shows that she understood the advice and she accepted the advice and she smiled. But when it comes to the second piece of advice, do not be afraid to start over, Esperanza accepts this advice, but she does not start her stitches over again. But she sighs, which implies she is impatient with it. She also complains on page 13 that she doesn't like to always crochet to take her mind off of worry. So we didn't reach page 13, but in page 13, she was saying that her mom and her grandma like to crochet because it kind of settles their mind and makes them not worried, but Esperanza doesn't like that as much. It doesn't really work for her. So when grandma said, do not be afraid to start over, Esperanza accepts this advice and she starts her stitches over again. But she sighs, which means that she's kind of impatient, that she's like, okay, and she starts over the stitches. So she isn't as excited about the advice as the first one, we can see. All right, so let's look at our last question, question number 4. So question number 4 says, on page 18, Esperanza says that a deep river runs between her and Miguel. What does this mean? How does Miguel respond when she tells him this? Use details from the text in your answer. So it looks like this question has 2 different questions in it. So first, we read it, and second, let's go ahead and understand what the question is asking. So Esperanza says that a deep river runs between her and Miguel. So she's saying that it's kind of like another metaphor. A deep river runs between them. So I don't really know what that means. Yeah, we're going to have to read a little bit more. So what does this mean? Also, how does Miguel respond when she tells him this information? So let's make sure that we're writing down notes again for number 4 as we're reading. And it's only 1 page this time, so hopefully it won't be too much. So let's get started on page 18. So we skipped a couple of pages, as you know, because I think we just finished up on 15. But this one says, but now that she was a young woman, she understood that Miguel was the housekeeper's son, and that she was the ranch owner's daughter, and between them a deep river ran. So what she's saying is that she understands that her friend Miguel, he isn't rich like she is. Miguel is the housekeeper's son, which means that his parents worked for her parents. And now that she's older, she understands that her father is the landowner, or the ranch owner, and so she does have more money. And with that, she says that a deep river runs between them. Esperanza stood on one side of the river, and Miguel stood on the other, and the river could never be crossed. In a moment of self-importance, Esperanza had told all of this to Miguel. Since then, he has only spoken a couple words to her. When their path crossed, he nodded and said politely, "Mi reina, my queen," but nothing more. There was no teasing or laughing or talking about every little thing. Esperanza pretended not to care, though she secretly wished she had never told Miguel about the river. So in my notes, I wrote down about how Miguel is not a wealthy landowner. He's the housekeeper's son. And then I wrote down that Esperanza is more wealthy because her parents own the land. And so she had told Miguel this information about how she said that a deep river runs between them and that it won't be crossed. And obviously, Miguel seems a little bit upset. It says that he hasn't spoken many words to her, that there's no more teasing or laughing, or they're not talking about things anymore. And Esperanza wished that she hadn't told Miguel this information. Distracted, Mama paced out the window, each step making a hollow tapping sound on the tile floor. Hortensia lit the lamps. The minutes passed into hours. "I hear riders," said Mama, and then she ran for the door. But it was only Tio Luis and Tio Marco. So in this scene, they're still waiting for Papa to come home. He still hasn't returned yet. So these were the words that I wrote down for number 4. So I wrote down that I saw there was different wealth. So I read that Esperanza was the landowner's daughter, so she had more money, and that Miguel was a worker. He was the housekeeper's son. They didn't own the land that they lived on. And then I should have wrote this, but I also should have added that Miguel seemed kind of upset when Esperanza told him this information. So I also thought that this metaphor of a deep river running between them was a little bit hard to understand. So what I did is I went ahead and I drew a picture of what this looked like. So I showed the deep blue river and Esperanza on one side and Miguel on the other side. And Esperanza says that a deep river runs between me and Miguel. And she also says that this river can never be crossed. So I thought of this as kind of like a barrier between them and that they can't cross over to each other's sides. And so basically what this metaphor means is that Esperanza is on one side, and this is her life. She's rich, she's wealthy, her parents own the land. But then on the other side of the river is Miguel, and his life is that his parents don't have as much money, and they work on the land. They don't own the land. So the deep river that runs between them is kind of like a barrier between both of their lives, is a good way to recognize that. And so I learned that mostly just through drawing that picture and really being able to visualize Esperanza's life on one side and Miguel's life on the other side. So let's remind ourselves what question number 4 was. On page 18, Esperanza says that a deep river runs between her and Miguel. What does this mean? How does Miguel respond when she tells him this? Use details from the text to answer your question. So I just explained what I thought the river meant. So I'm going to wait to give you your answer right now, and I want you to go ahead and write down what you think this means in your own words. So you can go back and watch this through a little bit more if you wanted to rehear what my answer was. You can also go back and see the notes that I wrote down, but go ahead and pause right now and try to write down your own answer. Okay, so I'm going to show you what I wrote. So I said she, as in Esperanza, is talking about the wealth that divides them, because Esperanza is a ranch owner or a landowner's daughter, and Miguel is a housekeeper's son. Also, Miguel's family are Native Americans, as we read that his mom was of an Indian tribe, and Esperanza is of Spanish descent. Miguel seems to be angry or hurt since he doesn't speak to her anymore. So in my answer, I wrote down that it's the wealth that divides them. And I wrote down that Esperanza is a wealthy landowner's daughter, but then Miguel is a housekeeper's son. And then also Miguel's Native American, where she is of Spanish descent. So they are also of different ethnicities as well. And then also I wrote down that Miguel seems to be angry about this, about Esperanza telling him that the river runs between them because we saw that he doesn't speak to her anymore. So that was a lot of information we just read through, a lot of reading. So great job sticking with that and going over a comprehension question. So comprehension questions are really important to know so that we understand the reading better. So I'm so glad that you practiced that with me today. So let's do a quick recap of what we've done today in our lesson. So number 1, we practiced finding answers to comprehension questions. And the way that we did this is that step one, we read thoroughly through the question, which means we read the question really well. Then we understood what the question was actually asking us to do. And then lastly, we wrote down notes as we read. And this is also called annotating. So we annotated, which also means like writing down notes. It's writing down any important words, anything like that. And so that was our third step, is that we wrote down in our notebook notes for each question. The second thing that we did is that we used evidence from the text to help us form our answers. So a lot of the questions at the end said use evidence from the text. So we looked back on those pages, we wrote down our notes and everything so that we could have evidence to use for our answers. So by doing that, we gave page numbers to show where we found our information. So where that would say like P period 8, P period 11, anything like that, it was because we wrote down what page we found our information on. And then we also use complete sentences to answer our questions. So even though our notes don't have to be in complete sentences, just because they're quick reminders for us, we wanted to make sure that our answers were in complete sentences. So that is all that I have for you today. Thank you so much for reading through all of those pages with me and practicing. So if you want, you can go back through and you can read through chapter 2 entirely. I know that we skipped a couple of pages here and there for their questions. So feel free to go back through and read through chapter 2 to get all the information. You can also start reading chapter 3 if you would like to get ready for our next lesson. But thank you for all of the hard work you did today, and I will see you next time.